It began quietly, with a few addresses changing hands. The Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, took up residence at Fort McNair in Washington, an elegant home once reserved for the Army's Vice Chief of Staff. A short distance away, Secretary of State Marco Rubio moved into another house on the same row of officers' quarters. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem followed, citing safety concerns after a series of public threats. The administration explained these moves as practical, cost-effective, secure, and logistically efficient. On paper, it was a solution to overcrowded neighborhoods and heightened risks. In practice, it marked the first visible merging of the civilian executive and the military's physical domain. Such moments rarely announce their significance. They appear administrative, even banal: leases, permits, moving trucks. But this kind of relocation often functions as the entry point for something larger. A confidence pattern, a familiar choreography by which power rearranges itself under the cover of prudence. It always begins the same way. A government sells a change as sensible and protective. Once in place, it normalizes new hierarchies and proximities that quietly reshape the flow of authority. In time, it exploits those new positions, turning circumstance into leverage. The logic is deceptively simple. Justification leads to normalization, leads to utilization. And once begun, the sequence tends to complete itself. History shows this pattern unfolding again and again, usually at moments when governments feel threatened or uncertain. In 1959, Pakistan's leaders moved their capital from Karachi to the planned city of Islamabad, promising order and safety. The city was built beside the Army's general headquarters, and before long, civilian and military calendars became one. In 2005, Myanmar's generals announced a move to a new administrative capital, Nay Pyi Taw, for similar reasons. Ministries were placed inside a garrison city where military convoys and civil servants shared the same infrastructure. Even in the late Roman Republic, commanders entering the city to restore order soon found that proximity to the Senate made command irresistible. Each time, the story began as a matter of efficiency or protection and ended as an architecture of control. The same dynamic is visible, in embryonic form, in Washington now. The White House assures that officials pay rent, that no law is broken, that these are only temporary arrangements. But once civilian leadership embeds itself within the military's protective shell, proximity alone changes the relationship. Lines blur. The general who runs the base becomes host to a cabinet member. Daily logistics, security protocols, even ceremony begin to reflect that new order of precedence. What was sold as a convenience becomes a condition, one that grants the civilian hierarchy not only residence within the military domain, but supervision over it. That is how the confidence pattern works. It persuades before it transforms, and only later does one notice that the terrain of governance has shifted. The capital grows quieter, more guarded. Authority grows harder to distinguish from command. And as history warns, the first pattern never stands alone. Once the seed is planted, it tends to germinate into others. Physical cohabitation leads naturally to architectural expansion, the non-linear growth of executive space that isolates leadership from the public. Normalized proximity justifies the retrospective permanence of military presence in civic life. Together they form the reinforcing loops of an admino-military compound, where security, administration, and legitimacy feed one another until separation becomes impossible. That, more than the individual addresses at Fort McNair, is the story now beginning to unfold. Once the first boxes were unpacked, the move ceased to be symbolic and became structural. Cabinet members now live on bases that operate 24 hours a day under military command, within perimeters guarded by soldiers, in homes serviced by personnel who report through the Department of Defense. The daily rhythm? Convoys, security details, coordination calls, makes the distinction between civilian official and military tenant increasingly theoretical. Integration begins not through decree, but through routine. This is how the system digests new occupants. It folds them into its logic of clearance levels, chain of command, and access control until the arrangement feels inevitable. It is a rhythm familiar to any institution where civilians and soldiers share space for too long. The British Empire's civil lines grew beside its cantonments for precisely this reason. Administrators and officers becoming one governing organism whose day began with the same bugle and ended with the same reports. Pakistan's twin capitals, Islamabad and Rawalpindi, matured the same way. Bureaucrats and generals commuting along the same highway until codependence became culture. Integration rarely announces itself. It simply erases the idea that things were ever separate. The same process is visible in Washington now. Officers accustomed to housing rotation defer to civilian appointees with indefinite tenure. Military staff tasked with facility maintenance take orders, however mundane, from political leadership. The boundary of command shifts by degrees until the question of who supervises whom becomes politely irrelevant. The Defense Secretary's residence becomes, functionally, an extension of his office. The base's logistical chain becomes part of his administrative apparatus. No confrontation occurs. The integration happens by osmosis. That is how the reinforcement pattern establishes itself. Each justification reproduces the next. Security leads to co-location, co-location to cooperation, cooperation to dependency, and dependency to more security. A single arrangement becomes self-validating. We live here because it is secure. It is secure because we live here. The pattern locks into place without a single order being given. Parallel to this quiet integration, construction crews have begun dismantling the east wing of the White House. In its place, a new complex is rising, a 90,000 square foot ballroom and event wing, larger than the original residence itself. Officially, it is a modernization, a venue for state dinners, summits, and ceremonies that will, as the press release put it, showcase American greatness. Yet the scale tells a different story. The East Wing, once an appendage for public tours and First Lady offices, is being transformed into a sealed environment, a building meant to contain events rather than connect them. Architecturally, this is the second stage of the pattern, non-linear expansion. Each addition is justified as practical, but the cumulative effect is enclosure. Power consolidates by increasing the space it controls and decreasing the permeability of its boundaries. The result is not mere grandeur, it is insulation. The precedent is older than the Republic itself. Louis XIV did the same at Versailles, extending a hunting lodge into a labyrinth of courtyards and galleries that pulled the nobility inside the king's orbit, away from Paris and its unrest. The Führerbau in Berlin, later the new Reich Chancellery, repeated the gesture in a modern idiom. Miles of marble corridors that staged authority while screening it from the street. In Beijing, the leadership compound of Zhongnanhai followed the same logic, its walls rising higher after every protest, its gates narrowing until the state itself lived behind glass and guard posts. Washington is still far from that condition, but the vector is recognizable. A larger, more fortified executive wing alters the relationship between ruler and ruled as surely as any law. The city sees less of its government. The government sees less of its city. Public tours suspended for renovation become a metaphor for a broader withdrawal. The executive branch is building not just an addition, but a habitat, one that can host, defend, and contain itself. Meanwhile, a separate but related phenomenon has been taking shape on the city's streets. National Guard units, originally called up for crowd control and emergency support, have remained deployed across the capital. Their mission has expanded from temporary protection to what officials describe as stabilization and maintenance. The uniforms have become as common a sight as police cruisers. Their presence, once newsworthy, now passes without notice. This is the retrospective pattern at work, the logic by which the exceptional becomes ordinary. Each extension of deployment is defended by pointing to the same conditions it perpetuates. We remain because the city is unsettled, the briefings say, and the city is unsettled because soldiers remain. It is, the oldest feedback loop in the language of security. Thailand learned it in 2014, when martial law declared to restore order matured into the National Council for Peace and Order, a junta that rewrote the constitution. Egypt rehearsed it through repeated renewals of its emergency law from 2017 to 2021, each renewal citing the necessity created by the previous one. Rome learned it 2 millennia earlier, when Sulla's legions lingered in the Forum long after the crisis had passed. Once a city grows accustomed to soldiers in its streets, the argument for their removal sounds less like prudence and more like risk. In Washington, the troops do not yet command, but their permanence redefines normal. The capital of a democracy now lives under a security regime designed for permanence, and, honestly, few residents can remember when the fences came down. The justifications echo those heard in other capitals at the threshold of transformation: temporary, necessary, stabilizing. Every repetition strengthens the belief that civil order depends on military presence, that governance itself has become a branch of defense. Seen together, these developments, civilian officials housed on bases and expanding and fortified executive residence, a standing military presence in civic space, form the outline of a single structure. Each reinforces the others. The residential integration legitimizes the architectural expansion. The expansion justifies the security posture. The security posture normalizes the integration. Administration, military, and legitimacy become a closed circuit. It is really the early geometry of an ad minor military compound, a governing organism that lives inside its own perimeter, sustained by the conviction that protection and authority are the same thing. This pattern does not require conspiracy or decree. It advances through reasonable measures: housing assignments, construction budgets, security briefings, each step defensible on its own. Only in combination does their logic become visible. History has traced the curve of that logic many times, from Versailles to Nai Pyi, from Islamabad to Berlin. It begins with proximity, grows through enclosure, and hardens into permanence. And once a government learns to govern from within its walls, it seldom finds its way back out. Every republic learns the same truth in its own time. Boundaries exist for a reason. They are not obstacles to efficiency or inconveniences to be designed away. They are the hard-earned architecture of restraint, lines drawn to keep the instruments of power from turning inward. Civilian and military, private and official, open and secure. These divisions were not arbitrary. They were the product of centuries of painful correction, written in the ruins left by governments that forgot why separation mattered. The norms now being treated as expendable. The expectation that civilian officials live among civilians, that the executive remain accessible to the governed, that soldiers serve the state but do not share its hearth, are not ornamental niceties. They were created to prevent precisely the convergence we are watching take shape. When those boundaries blur, history's record is unambiguous. Versailles ended with a mob at the gates, Berlin's chancellery with fire in its tunnels, the Roman Republic with soldiers quartered in the Senate. Each time, the comfort of proximity and the logic of protection eroded the distance that made accountability possible. Each time, the state's guardians became its governors and its citizens their spectators. The warning is not that the present administration has invented something new. It is that it is repeating something old, something the constitutional order was designed to preclude. A government that shelters within its own security apparatus, that expands its palace while enclosing its streets, is a government forgetting what those walls were meant to keep out. They were never meant to be comfortable. They were meant to remind power of its limits. Restoration, then, is not nostalgia. It is repair. It begins with returning civilians to civilian life, reopening the gates that should never have closed, and reaffirming that safety is not the measure of liberty. It is its condition, not its purpose. The machinery of democracy depends on friction between branches, between uniformed command and elected will, between the public square and the guarded office. Remove that friction, and the system runs smooth only because it has stopped moving. The city still has time to remember itself. The troops can be sent home, the White House can reopen its doors, the cabinet can return to neighborhoods where a fence means a garden, not a perimeter. These are not symbolic gestures, they are the acts by which a republic reclaims its proportions. The longer it delays, the more certain it will be that the fortifications were built not to protect the people, but to keep them out.